He stood for a moment at his own hall door, looking sedately at the elegant equipage as it rattled away. On his return upstairs, the rest of the guests soon dispersed, and he was left alone. Being a great reader of all kinds of literature, and never at all apologetic for that weakness, he sat down comfortably to read. The clock upon his study table pointed to a few minutes short of 12, when his attention was called to it by a ringing at the doorbell. A man of plain habits, he had sent his servants to bed and must needs go down to open the door. He went down, and there found a man without hat or coat, whose shirt sleeves were rolled up tight to his shoulders. For a moment he thought the man had been fighting, the rather as he was much agitated and out of breath. A second look, however, showed him that the man was particularly clean and not otherwise discomposed as to his dress than as it answered this description. "I come from the warm baths, sir, round in the neighbouring street." "And what is the matter at the warm baths?" "Would you please to come directly, sir? We found that lying on the table." He put into the physician's hand a scrap of paper. The physician looked at it and read his own name and address written in pencil, nothing more. He looked closer at the writing, looked at the man, took his hat from its peg, put the key of his door in his pocket, and they hurried away together. When they came to the warm baths, all the other people belonging to that establishment were looking out for them at the door and running up and down the passages. "Request everybody else to keep back, if you please," said the physician aloud to the master. "And do you take me straight to the place, my friend?" to the messenger. The messenger hurried before him along a grove of little rooms, and turning into one at the end of the grove, looked round the door. The physician was close upon him, and looked round the door too. There was a bath in that corner, from which the water had been hastily drained off. Lying in it, as in a grave or sarcophagus, with a hurried drapery of sheet and blanket thrown across it, was the body of a heavily made man, with an obtuse head and coarse, mean, common features. A skylight had been opened to release the steam with which the room had been filled, but it hung condensed into water drops, heavily upon the walls and heavily upon the face and figure in the bath. The room was still hot, and the marble of the bath still warm, but the face and figure were clammy to the touch. The white marble at the bottom of the bath was veined with a dreadful red. On the ledge at the side were an empty laudanum bottle and a tortoise-shell-handled penknife, soiled, but not with ink. Separation of jugular vein, death rapid, been dead at least half an hour. This echo of the physician's words ran through the passages and little rooms, and through the house while he was yet straightening himself from having bent down to reach to the bottom of the bath, and while he was yet dabbing his hands in water, redly veining it as the marble was veined, before it mingled into one tint. He turned his eyes to the dress upon the sofa, and to the watch, money, and pocket-book on the table. A folded note, half buckled up in the pocket-book, and half protruding from it, caught his observant glance. He looked at it, touched it, pulled it a little further out from among the leaves, said quietly, "This is addressed to me," and opened and read it. There were no directions for him to give. The people of the house knew what to do. The proper authorities were soon brought, and they took an equable, business-like possession of the deceased, and of what had been his property, with no greater disturbance of manner or countenance than usually attends the winding up of a clock. Physician was glad to walk out into the night air, was even glad, in spite of his great experience, to sit down upon a doorstep for a little while, feeling sick and faint. Bar was a near neighbour of his, and, when he came to the house, he saw a light in the room where he knew his friend often sat late getting up his work. As the light was never there when Bar was not, it gave him assurance that Bar was not yet in bed. In fact, this busy bee had a verdict to get tomorrow against evidence, and was improving the shining hours in setting snares for the gentlemen of the jury. The physician's knock astonished Bar, but as he immediately suspected that somebody had come to tell him that somebody else was robbing him or otherwise trying to get the better of him, He came down promptly and softly. He had been clearing his head with a lotion of cold water as a good preparative to providing hot water for the heads of the jury, and had been reading with the neck of his shirt thrown wide open that he might the more freely choke the opposite witnesses. In consequence, he came down looking rather wild. Seeing Physician, the least expected of men, he looked wilder and said, "What's the matter?" "You asked me once what Myrtle's complaint was?" "Extraordinary answer, I know I did." "I told you I had not found out?" "Yes, I know you did." "I have found it out." "My God," said Barr, starting back and clapping his hand upon the other's breast. "And so have I. I see it in your face." They went into the nearest room, where Physician gave him the letter to read. He read it through half a dozen times. There was not much in it as to quantity, but it made a great demand on his close and continuous attention. He could not sufficiently give utterance to his regret that he had not himself found a clue to this. The smallest clue, he said, would have made him master of the case, and what a case it would have been to have got to the bottom of. Physician had engaged to break the intelligence in Harley Street. Barr could not at once return to his inveiglements of the most enlightened and remarkable jury he had ever seen in that box, with whom, he could tell his learned friend, no shallow sophistry would go down, and no unhappily abused professional tact and skill prevail. This was the way he meant to begin with them. So he said he would go too, and would loiter to and fro near the house while his friend was inside. They walked there, the better to recover self-possession in the air, and the wings of day were fluttering the night when Physician knocked at the door. A footman of rainbow hues in the public eye was sitting up for his master, that is to say, was fast asleep in the kitchen over a couple of candles and a newspaper, demonstrating the great accumulation of mathematical odds against the probabilities of a house being set on fire by accident when this serving man was roused. Physician had still to await the rousing of the chief butler. At last that noble creature came into the dining-room in a flannel gown and list shoes, but with his cravat on and a chief butler all over. It was morning now. Physician had opened the shutters of one window while waiting, that he might see the light. Mrs. Myrtle's maid must be called, and told to get Mrs. Myrtle up and prepare her as gently as she can to see me. I have dreadful news to break to her. Thus, Physician to the chief butler. The latter, who had a candle in his hand, called his man to take it away. Then he approached the window with dignity, looking on at Physician's news exactly as he had looked on at the dinners in that very room. "Mr. Myrtle is dead." "I should wish," said the chief butler, "to give a month's notice." "Mr. Myrtle has destroyed himself." "Sir," said the chief butler, "that is very unpleasant to the feelings of one in my position, as calculated to awaken prejudice, and I should wish to leave immediately." "If you are not shocked, are you not surprised, man?" demanded the physician warmly. The chief butler, erect and calm, replied in these memorable words: "Sir, Mr. Myrtle never was the gentleman, and no ungentlemanly act on Mr. Myrtle's part would surprise me. Is there anybody else I can send to you, or any other directions I can give before I leave, respecting what you would wish to be done?" When Physician, after discharging himself of his trust upstairs, rejoined Barr in the street, he said no more of his interview with Mrs. Myrtle than that he had not yet told her all, but that what he had told her she had borne pretty well. Barr had devoted his leisure in the street to the construction of a most ingenious man-trap for catching the whole of his jury at a blow. Having got that matter settled in his mind, it was lucid on the late catastrophe, and then walked home slowly, discussing it in every bearing. Before parting at the physician's door, they both looked up at the sunny morning sky, into which the smoke of a few early fires and the breath and voices of a few early stirrers were peacefully rising, and then looked round upon the immense city and said, "If all those hundreds and thousands of beggared people who were yet asleep could only know, as they too spoke, the ruin that impended over them, What a fearful cry against one miserable soul would go up to heaven! The report that the great man was dead got about with astonishing rapidity. At first he was dead of all the diseases that ever were known, and of several brand new maladies invented with the speed of light to meet the demand of the occasion. He had concealed a dropsy from infancy. He had inherited a large estate of water on the chest from his grandfather. He had had an operation performed upon him every morning of his life for 18 years. He had been subject to the explosion of important veins in his body after the manner of fireworks. He had had something the matter with his lungs. He had had something the matter with his heart. He had had something the matter with his brain. 500 people who sat down to breakfast, entirely uninformed on the whole subject, believed before they had done breakfast that they, privately and personally, knew physicians to have said to Mr. Merdle, "You must expect to go out some day like the snuff of a candle," and that they knew Mr. Merdle to have said to physician, "A man can die but once." By about 11 o'clock in the forenoon, something the matter with the brain became the favourite theory against the field, and by 12 something had been distinctly ascertained to be pressure. Pressure was so entirely satisfactory to the public mind, and seemed to make everybody so comfortable, that it might have lasted all day but for Barr's having taken the real state of the case into court at 9:30. This led to its beginning to be currently whispered all over London by about 1, that Mr. Merdle had killed himself. Pressure, however, so far from being overthrown by the discovery, became a greater favourite than ever. There was a general moralizing upon pressure in every street. All the people who had tried to make money and had not been able to do it said, "There you were. You no sooner began to devote yourself to the pursuit of wealth than you got pressure." The idle people improved the occasion in a similar manner. "See," said they, "what you brought yourself to by work, work, work. You persisted in working, you overdid it. Pressure came on you, and you were done for." This consideration was very potent in many quarters, but nowhere more so than among the young clerks and partners who had never been in the slightest danger of overdoing it. These, one and all, declared quite piously that they hoped they would never forget the warning as long as they lived, and that their conduct might be so regulated as to keep off pressure and preserve them a comfort to their friends for many years. But at about the time of high change, pressure began to wane, and appalling whispers to circulate east, west, north, and south. At first they were faint, and went no further than a doubt whether Mr. Merdle's wealth would be found to be as vast as had been supposed, whether there might not be a temporary difficulty in realizing it, whether there might not even be a temporary suspension, say a month or so, on the part of the wonderful bank. As the whispers became louder, which they did from that time every minute, they became more threatening. He had sprung from nothing by no natural growth or process that anyone could account for. He had been, after all, a low, ignorant fellow. He had been a down-looking man, and no one had ever been able to catch his eye. He had been taken up by all sorts of people in quite an unaccountable manner. He had never had any money of his own. His ventures had been utterly reckless, and his expenditure had been most enormous. In steady progression, as the day declined, the talk rose in sound and purpose. He had left a letter at the baths addressed to his physician, and his physician had got the letter, and the letter would be produced at the inquest on the morrow, and it would fall like a thunderbolt upon the multitude he had deluded. Numbers of men in every profession and trade would be blighted by his insolvency. Old people who had been in easy circumstances all their lives would have no place of repentance for their trust in him but the workhouse. Legions of women and children would have their whole future desolated by the hand of this mighty scoundrel. Every partaker of his magnificent feasts would be seen to have been a sharer in the plunder of innumerable homes. Every servile worshipper of riches who had helped to set him on his pedestal would have done better to worship the devil point blank. So the talk, lashed louder and higher by confirmation on confirmation, and by edition after edition of the evening papers, swelled into such a roar when night came as might have brought one to believe that a solitary watcher on the gallery above the dome of St. Paul's would have perceived the night air to be laden with a heavy muttering of the name of Merdle, coupled with every form of execration. For by the time it was known that the late Mr. Merdle's complaint had been simply forgery and robbery, he, the uncouth object of such widespread adulation, the sitter at great men's feasts, the roc's egg of great ladies' assemblies, the subduer of exclusiveness, the leveller of pride, the patron of patrons, the bargain driver with a minister for lordships of the circumlocution office, the recipient of more acknowledgment within some 10 or 15 years at most than had been bestowed in England upon all peaceful public benefactors, and upon all the leaders of all the arts and sciences, with all their works to testify for them during 2 centuries at least, he, the shining wonder, the new constellation to be followed by the wise men bringing gifts, until it stopped over a certain carrion at the bottom of a bath and disappeared, was simply the greatest forger and the greatest thief that ever cheated the gallows. Chapter 26. Reaping the Whirlwind. With a precursory sound of hurried breath and hurried feet, Mr. Panks rushed into Arthur Clennam's counting-house. The inquest was over, the letter was public, the bank was broken, the other model structures of straw had taken fire and were turned to smoke. The admired piratical ship had blown up, in the midst of a vast fleet of ships of all rates and boats of all sizes, and on the deep was nothing but ruin, nothing but burning hills, bursting magazines, great guns self-exploded, tearing friends and neighbours to pieces, drowning men clinging to unseaworthy spars, and going down every minute, spent swimmers floating dead, and sharks. The usual diligence and order of the counting-house at the works were overthrown. Unopened letters and unsorted papers lay strewn about the desk. In the midst of these tokens of prostrated energy and dismissed hope, the master of the counting-house stood idle in his usual place, with his arms crossed on the desk and his head bowed down upon them. Mr. Panks rushed in and saw him, and stood still. In another minute Mr. Panks' arms were on the desk, and Mr. Panks' head was bowed down upon them, and for some time they remained in these attitudes, idle and silent, with the width of the little room between them. Mr. Panks was the first to lift up his head and speak. "I persuaded you to it, Mr. Clennam. I know it. Say what you will. You can't say more to me than I say to myself. You can't say more than I deserve." "Oh, Panks, Panks," returned Clennam, "don't speak of deserving. What do I myself deserve?" "Better luck," said Panks. "I," pursued Clennam, without attending to him, "who have ruined my partner. Panks, Panks, I have ruined Doyce, the honest, self-helpful, indefatigable old man who has worked his way all through his life, the man who has contended against so much disappointment, and who has brought out of it such a good and hopeful nature, the man I have felt so much for and meant to be so true and useful to. I have ruined him, brought him to shame and disgrace, ruined him, ruined him." The agony into which the reflection wrought his mind was so distressing to see that Mr. Panks took hold of himself by the hair of his head and tore it in desperation at the spectacle. "Reproach me," cried Panks, "reproach me, sir, I'll do myself an injury. Say, you fool, you villain. Say, ass, how could you do it, beast? What did you mean by it? Catch hold of me somewhere. Say something abusive to me." All the time Mr. Panks was tearing at his tough hair in a most pitiless and cruel manner. "If you had never yielded to this fatal mania, Panks," said Clennam, more in commiseration than retaliation, "it would have been how much better for you, and how much better for me." "At me again, sir," cried Panks, grinding his teeth in remorse. "At me again. If you had never gone into those accursed calculations and brought out your results with such abominable clearness," groaned Clennam, It would have been how much better for you, Panks, and how much better for me." "At me again, sir," exclaimed Panks, loosening his hold of his hair. "At me again and again." Clennam, however, finding him already beginning to be pacified, had said all he wanted to say and more. He wrung his head, only adding, "Blind leaders of the blind, Panks, blind leaders of the blind. But Doyce, my injured partner." That brought his head down on the desk once more. Their former attitudes and their former silence were once more first encroached upon by Panks. "Not been to bed, sir, since it began to get about. Been high and low on the chance of finding some hope of saving any cinders from the fire. All in vain, all gone, all vanished." "I know it," returned Clennam, "too well." Mr. Panks filled up a pause with a groan that came out of the very depths of his soul. "Arthur, only yesterday, Monday, I had the fixed intention of selling, realizing, and making an end of it." "I can't say as much for myself, sir," returned Panks, "though it's wonderful how many people I've heard of who were going to realize yesterday, of all days in the 365, if it hadn't been too late." His steam-like breathings, usually droll in their effect, were more tragic than so many groans, while from head to foot he was in that begrimed, besmeared, neglected state that he might have been an authentic portrait of misfortune, which could scarcely be discerned through its want of cleaning. "Mr. Clennam, had you laid out everything?" He got over the break before the last word, and also brought out the last word itself with great difficulty. "Everything." Mr. Panks took hold of his tough hair again, and gave it such a wrench that he pulled out several prongs of it. After looking at these with an eye of wild hatred, he put them in his pocket. "My course," said Clennam, brushing away some tears that had been silently dropping down his face, "must be taken at once. What wretched amends I can make must be made. I must clear my unfortunate partner's reputation. I must retain nothing for myself. I must resign to our creditors the power of management I have so much abused, and I must work out as much of my fault or crime as is susceptible of being worked out in the rest of my days." "Is it impossible, sir, to tide over the present?" "Out of the question. Nothing can be tided over now, Panks. The sooner the business can pass out of my hands, the better for it. There are engagements to be met this week, which would bring the catastrophe before many days were over, even if I would postpone it for a single day by going on for that space, secretly knowing what I know. All last night I thought of what I would do. What remains is to do it." "Not entirely of yourself," said Panks, whose face was as damp as if his steam were turning into water as fast as he dismally blew it off. "Have some legal help. Perhaps I had better. Have Rugg. There is not much to do. He will do it as well as another. Shall I fetch Rugg, Mr. Clennam?" "If you could spare the time, I should be much obliged to you." Mr. Panks put on his hat that moment and steamed away to Pentonville. While he was gone, Arthur never raised his head from the desk, but remained in that one position. Mr. Panks brought his friend and professional adviser, Mr. Rugg, back with him. Mr. Rugg had had such ample experience on the road of Mr. Panks's being at that present in an irrational state of mind that he opened his professional mediation by requesting that gentleman to take himself out of the way. Mr. Panks, crushed and submissive, obeyed. "He is not like what my daughter was, sir, when we began the breach of promise action of Rugg and Borkins, in which she was plaintiff," said Mr. Rugg. "He takes too strong and direct an interest in the case. His feelings are worked upon. There is no getting on in our profession with feelings worked upon, sir." As he pulled off his gloves and put them in his hat, he saw in a side glance or two that a great change had come over his client. "I'm sorry to perceive it, sir," said Mr. Rugg, "that you have been allowing your own feelings to be worked upon. Now, pray don't. These losses are much to be deplored, sir, but we must look 'em in the face. If the money I have sacrificed had been all my own, Mr. Rugg, sighed Mr. Clennam. "I should have cared far less." "Indeed, sir," said Mr. Rugg, rubbing his hands with a cheerful air. "You surprise me. That's singular, sir. I have generally found in my experience that it's their own money people are most particular about. I have seen people get rid of a good deal of other people's money and bear it very well indeed." With these comforting remarks, Mr. Rugg seated himself on an office stool at the desk and proceeded to business. "Now, Mr. Clennam, by your leave, let us go into the matter. Let us see the state of the case. The question is simple. The question is the usual plain, straightforward, common-sense question. What can we do for ourselves? What can we do for ourselves?" "This is not the question with me, Mr. Rugg," said Arthur. "You mistake it in the beginning. It is, what can I do for my partner? How can I best make reparation to him?" "I am afraid, sir, do you know," argued Mr. Rugg persuasively, "that you are still allowing your feeling to be worked upon. I don't like the term reparation, sir, except as a lever in the hands of counsel. Will you excuse my saying that I feel it my duty to offer you the caution that you really must not allow your feelings to be worked upon?" "Mr. Rugg," said Clennam, nerving himself to go through with what he had resolved upon, and surprising that gentleman by appearing, in his despondency, to have a settled determination of purpose, "you give me the impression that you will not be much disposed to adopt the course I have made up my mind to take. If your disapproval of it should render you unwilling to discharge such business as it necessitates, I am sorry for it, and must seek other aid. But I will represent to you at once that to argue against it with me is useless." "Good sir," answered Mr. Rugg, shrugging his shoulders. "Good sir. Since the business is to be done by some hands, let it be done by mine. Such was my principle in the case of Rugg and Borkins. Such is my principle in most cases." Clennam then proceeded to state to Mr. Rugg his fixed resolution. He told Mr. Rugg that his partner was a man of great simplicity and integrity, and that in all he meant to do he was guided above all things by a knowledge of his partner's character and a respect for his feelings. He explained that his partner was then absent on an enterprise of importance, and that it particularly behoved himself publicly to accept the blame of what he had rashly done, and publicly to exonerate his partner from all participation in the responsibility of it, lest the successful conduct of that enterprise should be endangered by the slightest suspicion wrongly attaching to his partner's honour and credit in another country. He told Mr. Rugg that to clear his partner morally to the fullest extent, and publicly and unreservedly to declare that he, Arthur Clennam of that firm, had of his own sole act, and even expressly against his partner's caution, embarked his resources in the swindles that had lately perished, was the only real atonement within his power, was a better atonement to the particular man than it would be to many men, and was therefore the atonement he had first to make. With this view, his intention was to print a declaration to the foregoing effect, which he had already drawn up, and, besides circulating it among all who had dealings with the house, to advertise it in the public papers. Concurrently with this measure, the description of which cost Mr. Rugg innumerable wry faces and great uneasiness in his limbs, he would address a letter to all the creditors, exonerating his partner in a solemn manner, informing them of the stoppage of the house until their pleasure could be known and his partner communicated with, and humbly submitting himself to their direction. If, through their consideration for his partner's innocence, the affairs could ever be got into such train as that the business could be profitably resumed and its present downfall overcome, then his own share in it should revert to his partner, as the only reparation he could make to him in money value for the distress and loss he had unhappily brought upon him, and he himself, at a small salary as he could live upon, would ask to be allowed to serve the business as a faithful clerk. Though Mr. Rugg saw plainly there was no preventing this from being done, still the wryness of his face and the uneasiness of his limbs so sorely required the propitiation of a protest that he made one. "I offer no objection, sir," said he. "I argue no point with you. I will carry out your views, sir, but under protest." Mr. Rugg then stated, not without prolixity, the heads of his protest. These were, in effect, because the whole town, or he might say the whole country, was in the first madness of the late discovery, and the resentment against the victims would be very strong, those who had not been deluded being certain to wax exceedingly wroth with them for not having been as wise as they were, and those who had been deluded being certain to find excuses and reasons for themselves, of which they were equally certain to see that other sufferers were wholly devoid, not to mention the great probability of every individual sufferer persuading himself to his violent indignation that but for the example of all the other sufferers he never would have put himself in the way of suffering. Because such a declaration as Clennam's made at such time would certainly draw down upon him a storm of animosity, rendering it impossible to calculate on forbearance in the creditors or on unanimity among them, and exposing him a solitary target to a straggling crossfire which might bring him down from half a dozen quarters at once. To all this, Clennam merely replied that, granting the whole protest, nothing in it lessened the force, or could lessen the force, of the voluntary and public exoneration of his partner. He therefore, once and for all, requested Mr. Rugg's immediate aid in getting the business dispatched. Upon that, Mr. Rugg fell to work, and Arthur, retaining no property to himself but his clothes and books, and a little loose money, placed his small private banker's account with the papers of the business. The disclosure was made, and the storm raged fearfully. Thousands of people were wildly staring about for somebody alive to heap reproaches on, and this notable case, courting publicity, set the living somebody so much wanted on a scaffold. When people who had nothing to do with the case were so sensible of its flagrancy, people who lost money by it could scarcely be expected to deal mildly with it. Letters of reproach and invective showered in from the creditors, and Mr. Rugg, who sat upon the high stool every day and read them all, informed his client within a week that he feared there were writs out. "I must take the consequences of what I have done," said Clennam. "The writs will find me here." On the very next morning, as he was turning in Bleeding Heart Yard by Mrs. Plawnish's corner, Mrs. Plawnish stood at the door waiting for him, and mysteriously besought him to step into Happy Cottage. There he found Mr. Rugg. "I thought I'd wait for you here. I wouldn't go on to the counting-house this morning if I was you, sir." "Why not, Mr. Rugg?" "There are as many as 5 out, to my knowledge." "It cannot be too soon over," said Clennam. "Let them take me at once." "Yes, but," said Mr. Rugg, getting between him and the door, "hear reason, hear reason. They'll take you soon enough, Mr. Clennam, I don't doubt, but hear reason. It almost always happens, in these cases, that some insignificant matter pushes itself in front and makes much of itself. Now, I find there's a little one out, a mere palace court jurisdiction, and I have reason to believe that a caption may be made upon that. I wouldn't be taken upon that." "Why not?" asked Clennam. "I'd be taken on a full-grown one, sir," said Mr. Rugg. "It's as well to keep up appearances. As your professional adviser, I should prefer your being taken on a writ from one of the superior courts, if you have no objection to do me that favour. It looks better." "Mr. Rugg," said Arthur in his dejection, "my only wish is that it should be over. I will go on and take my chance." "Another word of reason, sir," cried Mr. Rugg. "Now, this is reason. The other may be taste, but this is reason. If you should be taken on a little one, sir, you would go to the Marshalsea. Now, you know what the Marshalsea is? Very close, excessively confined. Whereas in the King's Bench—" Mr. Rugg waved his right hand freely as expressing abundance of space. "I would rather," said Clennam, "be taken to the Marshalsea than to any other prison." "Do you say so indeed, sir?" returned Mr. Rugg. "Then this is taste too, and we may be walking." He was a little offended at first, but he soon overlooked it. They walked through the yard to the other end. The Bleeding Hearts were more interested in Arthur since his reverses than formerly, now regarding him as one who was true to the place and had taken up his freedom. Many of them came out to look after him, and to observe to one another with great unctuousness that he was pulled down by it. Mrs. Plornish and her father stood at the top of the steps at their own end, much depressed, and shaking their heads. There was nobody visibly in waiting when Arthur and Mr. Rugg arrived at the counting-house, but an elderly member of the Jewish persuasion, preserved in rum, followed them close, and looked in at the glass before Mr. Rugg had opened one of the day's letters. "Oh," said Mr. Rugg, looking up. "How do you do? Step in. Mr. Clennam, I think this is the gentleman I was mentioning." This gentleman explained the object of his visit to be a trifling matter of business, and executed his legal function. "Shall I accompany you, Mr. Clennam?" asked Mr. Rugg politely, rubbing his hands. "I would rather go alone, thank you. Be so good as send me my clothes." Mr. Rugg, in a light, airy way, replied in the affirmative, and shook hands with him. He and his attendant then went downstairs, got into the first conveyance they found, and drove to the old gates. "Where I little thought, heaven forgive me," said Clennam to himself, "that I should ever enter thus." Mr. Chivery was on the lock, and young John was in the lodge, either newly released from it or waiting to take his own spell of duty. Both were more astonished on seeing who the prisoner was than one might have thought turnkeys would have been. The elder Mr. Chivery shook hands with him in a shamefaced kind of way and said, "I don't call to mind, sir, as I was ever less glad to see you." The young Mr. Chivery, more distant, did not shake hands with him at all. He stood looking at him in a state of indecision so observable that it even came within the observation of Clennam, with his heavy eyes and heavy heart. Presently afterwards, young John disappeared into the jail. As Clennam knew enough of the place to know that he was required to remain in the lodge a certain time, he took a seat in a corner and feigned to be occupied with the perusal of letters from his pocket. They did not so engross his attention, but that he saw with gratitude how the elder Mr. Chivery kept the lodge clear of prisoners, how he signed to some with his keys not to come in, how he nudged others with his elbows to go out, and how he made his misery as easy to him as he could. Arthur was sitting with his eyes fixed on the floor, recalling the past, brooding over the present, and not attending to either, when he felt himself touched upon the shoulder. It was by young John, and he said, "You can come now." He got up and followed young John. When they had gone a step or two within the inner iron gate, young John turned and said to him, "You want a room. I've got you one." "I thank you heartily." Young John turned again and took him in at the old doorway, up the old staircase, into the old room. Arthur stretched out his hand. Young John looked at it, looked at him, sternly, swelled, choked, and said, "I don't know as I can. No, I find I can't, but I thought you'd like the room, and here it is for you." Surprise at this inconsistent behaviour yielded when he was gone. He went away directly, to the feelings which the empty room awakened in Clennam's wounded breast, and to the crowding associations with the one good and gentle creature who had sanctified it. Her absence in his altered fortunes made it, and him in it, so very desolate and so much in need of such a face of love and truth, that he turned against the wall to weep, sobbing out as his heart relieved itself, "Oh, my little Dorrit!" Chapter 27. The Pupil of the Marshalsea. The day was sunny, and the Marshalsea, with the hot noon striking upon it, was unwontedly quiet. Arthur Clennam dropped into a solitary armchair, itself as faded as any debtor in the jail, and yielded himself to his thoughts. In the unnatural peace of having gone through the dreaded arrest and got there, the first change of feeling which the prison most commonly induced, and from which dangerous resting-place so many men had slipped down to the depths of degradation and disgrace by so many ways. He could think of some passages in his life almost as if he were removed from them into another state of existence. Taking into account where he was, the interest that had first brought him there when he had been free to keep away, and the gentle presence that was equally inseparable from the walls and bars about him, and from the impalpable remembrances of his later life which no walls or bars could imprison, it was not remarkable that everything his memory turned upon should bring him round again to Little Dorrit. Yet it was remarkable to him not because of the fact itself, but because of the reminder it brought with it, how much the dear little creature had influenced his better resolutions. None of us clearly know to whom or to what we are indebted in this wise, until some marked stop in the whirling wheel of life brings the right perception with it. It comes with sickness, it comes with sorrow, it comes with the loss of the dearly loved. It is one of the most frequent uses of adversity. It came to Clennam in his adversity strongly and tenderly. When I first gathered myself together, he thought, and set something like purpose before my jaded eyes, whom had I before me, toiling on for a good object's sake, without encouragement, without notice, against ignoble obstacles that would have turned an army of received heroes and heroines? One weak girl? When I tried to conquer my misplaced love, and to be generous to the man who was more fortunate than I, though he should never know it, or repay me with a gracious word, in whom had I watched patience, self-denial, self-subdual, charitable construction, the noblest generosity of the affections? In the same poor girl. If I, a man with a man's advantages and means and energies, had slighted the whisper in my heart that if my father had erred, it was my first duty to conceal the fault and to repair it, what youthful figure with tender feet going almost bare on the damp ground, with spare hands ever working, with its slight shape but half protected from the sharp weather, would have stood before me to put me to shame? Little Dorrit. So always, as he sat alone in the faded chair thinking, always Little Dorrit, until it seemed to him as if he met the reward of having wandered away from her and suffered anything to pass between him and his remembrance of her virtues. His door was opened, and the head of the elder Chivery was put in a very little way, without being turned towards him. "I am off the lot, Mr. Clennam, and going out. Can I do anything for you?" "Many thanks, nothing." "You'll excuse me opening the door," said Mr. Chivery, "but I couldn't make you hear." "Did you knock?" "Half a dozen times." Rousing himself, Clennam observed that the prison had awakened from its noontide doze, that the inmates were loitering about the shady yard, and that it was late in the afternoon. He had been thinking for hours. "Your things is come," said Mr. Chivery, "and my son is going to carry 'em up. I should have sent him up, but his wishing to carry him up himself. Indeed, he would have himself, and so I couldn't send him up. Mr. Clennam, could I say a word to you?" "Pray, come in," said Arthur, for Mr. Chivery's head was still put in at the door a very little way, and Mr. Chivery had but one ear upon him instead of both eyes. This was native delicacy to Mr. Chivery, true politeness, though his exterior had very much of a turnkey about it, and not the least of a gentleman. "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Chivery, without advancing. "It's no odds to me coming in. Mr. Clennam, don't you take no notice of my son, if you'll be so good, in case you find him cut up anyways difficult. My son has an art, and my son's art is in the right place. Me and his mother knows where to find it, and we find it situated correct." With this mysterious speech, Mr. Chivery took his ear away and shut the door. He might have been gone 10 minutes when his son succeeded him. "Here's your portmanteau," he said to Arthur, putting it carefully down. "It's very kind of you. I am ashamed that you should have the trouble." He was gone before it came to that, but soon returned, saying exactly as before, "Here's your black box," which he also put down with care. "I am very sensible of this attention. I hope we may shake hands now, Mr. John?" Young John, however, drew back, turning his right wrist in a socket made of his left thumb and middle finger, and said, as he had said at first, "I don't know as I can. No, I find I can't." He then stood regarding the prisoner sternly, though with a swelling humour in his eyes that looked like pity. "Why are you so angry with me," said Clennam, "and yet so ready to do me these kind services? There must be some mistake between us. If I have done anything to occasion it, I am sorry." "No mistake, sir," returned John, turning the wrist backwards and forwards in the socket, for which it was rather tight. "No mistake, sir, in the feelings with which my eyes behold you at the present moment. If I was at all fairly equal to your weight, Mr. Clennam, which I am not, and if you weren't under a cloud, which you are, and if it wasn't against all the rules of the Marshalsea, which it is, those feelings are such that they would stimulate me more to having it out with you in a round on the present spot than to anything else I could name." Arthur looked at him for a moment in some wonder and some little anger. "Well, well," he said, "a mistake, a mistake." Turning away, he sat down with a heavy sigh in the faded chair again. Young John followed him with his eyes, and after a short pause cried out, "I beg your pardon." "Freely granted," said Clennam, waving his hand without raising his sunken head. "Say no more. I am not worth it." "This furniture, sir," said young John, in a voice of mild and soft explanation, "belongs to me. I am in the habit of letting it out to parties without furniture that have the room. It ain't much, but it's at your service. Free, I mean. I could not think of letting you have it on any other terms. You're welcome to it for nothing." Arthur raised his head again to thank him, and to say he could not accept the favour. John was still turning his wrist, and still contending with himself in his former divided manner. "What is the matter between us?" said Arthur. "I decline to name it, sir," returned young John, suddenly turning loud and sharp. "Nothing's the matter." Arthur looked at him again in vain for an explanation of his behaviour. After a while, Arthur turned away his head again. Young John said presently afterwards, with the utmost mildness, "The little round table, sir, that's nigh your elbow was, you know whose. I needn't mention him. He died a great gentleman. I brought it of an individual that he gave it to, and that lived here after him. But the individual wasn't anyways equal to him. Most individuals would find it hard to come up to his level." Arthur drew the little table nearer, rested his arm upon it, and kept it there. "Perhaps you may not be aware, sir," said young John, "that I intruded upon him when he was over here in London. On the whole, he was of opinion that it was an intrusion, though he was so good as to ask me to sit down and to inquire after father and all other old friends, leastways humblest acquaintances. He looked, to me, a good deal changed, and I said so when I came back. I asked him if Miss Amy was well." "And she was?" "I should have thought you would have known without putting the question to such as me," returned young John, after appearing to take a large invisible pill. "Since you do put me the question, I am sorry I can't answer it. But the truth is, he looked upon the inquiry as a liberty, and said, 'What was that to me?' It was then I became quite aware I was intruding, of which I had been fearful before. However, he spoke very handsome afterwards, very handsome." They were both silent for several minutes, except that young John remarked at about the middle of the pause, "He both spoke and acted very handsome." It was again young John who broke the silence by inquiring, "If it's not a liberty, how long may it be your intention, sir, to go without eating and drinking?" "I have not felt the want of anything yet," returned Clennam. "I have no appetite just now." "The more reason why you should take some support, sir," urged young John. "If you find yourself going on sitting here for hours and hours, partaking of no refreshment because you have no appetite, why then you should and must partake of refreshment without an appetite. I'm going to have tea in my own apartment. If it's not a liberty, please to come and take a cup, or I can bring a tray here in 2 minutes." Feeling that young John would impose that trouble on himself if he refused, and also feeling anxious to show that he bore in mind both the elder Mr. Chivery's entreaty and the younger Mr. Chivery's apology, Arthur rose and expressed his willingness to take a cup of tea in Mr. John's apartment. Young John locked his door for him as they went out, slided the key into his pocket with great dexterity, and led the way to his own residence. It was at the top of the house nearest to the gateway. It was the room to which Clennam had hurried on the day when the enriched family had left the prison forever, and where he had lifted her insensible from the floor. He foresaw where they were going as soon as their feet touched the staircase. The room was so far changed that it was papered now, and had been repainted, and was far more comfortably furnished. But he could recall it just as he had seen it in that single glance, when he raised her from the ground and carried her down to the carriage. Young John looked hard at him, biting his fingers. "I see you recollect the room, Mr. Clennam." "I recollect it well, heaven bless her." Oblivious of the tea, young John continued to bite his fingers and to look at his visitor as long as his visitor continued to glance about the room. Finally, he made a start at the teapot, gustily rattled a quantity of tea into it from a container, and set off for the common kitchen to fill it with hot water. The room was so eloquent to Clennam in the changed circumstances of his return to the miserable Marshalsea, it spoke to him so mournfully of her and of his loss of her, that it would have gone hard with him to resist it, even though he had not been alone. Alone, he did not try. He had his hand on the insensible wall as tenderly as if it had been herself that he touched, and pronounced her name in a low voice. He stood at the window looking over the prison parapet with its grim spiked border, and breathed a benediction through the summer haze towards the distant land where she was rich and prosperous. Young John was some time absent, and, when he came back, showed that he had been outside by bringing with him fresh butter in a cabbage leaf, some thin slices of boiled ham in another cabbage leaf, and a little basket of watercresses and salad herbs. When these were arranged upon the table to his satisfaction, they sat down to tea. Clennam tried to do honour to the meal, but unavailingly. The ham sickened him, the bread seemed to turn to sand in his mouth. He could force nothing upon himself but a cup of tea. "Try a little something green," said young John, handing him the basket. He took a sprig or so of watercress and tried again, but the bread turned to a heavier sand than before, and the ham, though it was good enough of itself, seemed to blow a faint simoon of ham through the whole Marshalsea. "Try a little more something green, sir," said young John, and again handed the basket. It was so like handing green meat into the cage of a dull, imprisoned bird, and John had so evidently brought the little basket as a handful of fresh relief from the stale, hot paving stones and bricks of the jail, that Clennam said, with a smile, "It was very kind of you to think of putting this between the wires, but I cannot even get this down today." As if the difficulty were contagious, young John soon pushed away his own plate, and fell to folding the cabbage leaf that had contained the ham. When he had folded it into a number of layers, one over another, so that it was small in the palm of his hand, he began to flatten it between both his hands, and to eye Clennam attentively. "I wonder," he at length said, compressing his green packet with some force, "that if it's not worth your while to take care of yourself for your own sake, it's not worth doing it for someone else's." "Truly," returned Arthur, with a sigh and a smile, "I don't know for whose." "Mr. Clennam," said John warmly, "I am surprised that a gentleman who is capable of the straightforwardness that you are capable of should be capable of the mean action of making me such an answer. Mr. Clennam, I am surprised that a gentleman who is capable of having a heart of his own should be capable of the heartlessness of treating mine in that way. I am astonished at it, sir. Really and truly I am astonished." Having got upon his feet to emphasize his concluding words, young John sat down again and fell to rolling his green packet on his right leg, never taking his eyes off Clennam, but surveying him with a fixed look of indignant reproach. "I had got over it, sir," said John. "I had conquered it, knowing that it must be conquered, and had come to the resolution to think no more about it. I shouldn't have given my mind to it again, I hope, if to this prison you had not been brought, and in an hour unfortunate for me, this day. In his agitation, young John adopted his mother's powerful construction of sentences. When you first came upon me, sir, in the lodge this day, more as if a upas tree had been made a capture of than a private defendant, such mingled streams of feelings broke loose again with me, that everything was for the first few minutes swept away before me, and I was going round and round in a vortex. I got out of it. I struggled and got out of it. If it was the last word I had to speak against that vortex with my utmost powers, I strove, and out of it I came. I argued that if I had been rude, apologies was due, and those apologies, without a question of demeaning, I did make. And now, when I've been so wishful to show that one thought is next to being a holy one with me and goes before all others, now, after all, you dodge me when I ever so gently hinted it, and throw me back upon myself. For do not, sir, said young John, do not be so base as to deny that dodge you do, and throw me back upon myself you have. All amazement, Arthur gazed at him like one lost, only saying, What is it? What do you mean, John? But John, being in that state of mind in which nothing would seem to be more impossible to a certain class of people than the giving of an answer, went ahead blindly. I hadn't, John declared. No, I hadn't, and I never had the audaciousness to think, I am sure, that all was anything but lost. I hadn't, no, why shouldn't I say I hadn't if I ever had, any hope that it was possible to be so blessed, not after the words that passed, not even if barriers insurmountable had not been raised. But is that a reason why I am to have no memory, why I am to have no thoughts, why I am to have no sacred spots, nor anything? What can you mean? Cried Arthur. It's all very well to trample on it, sir, John went on, scouring a very prairie of wild words. If a person can make up his mind to be guilty of the action, it's all very well to trample on it, but it's there. It may be that it couldn't be trampled upon if it wasn't there, but that doesn't make it gentlemanly, that doesn't make it honourable, that doesn't justify throwing a person back upon himself after he has struggled and strived out of himself like a butterfly. The world may sneer at a turnkey, but he's a man, when he isn't a woman, which among female criminals is expected to be. Ridiculous as the incoherence of his talk was, there was yet a truthfulness in young John's simple, sentimental character, and a sense of being wounded in some very tender respect, expressed in his burning face and in the agitation of his voice and manner, which Arthur must have been cruel to disregard. He turned his thoughts back to the starting point of this unknown injury, and in the meantime young John, having rolled his green packet pretty round, cut it carefully into 3 pieces, and laid it on a plate as if it were some particular delicacy. It seems to me just possible, said Arthur, when he had retraced the conversation to the watercresses and back again, that you have made some reference to Miss Dorrit. It is just possible, sir, returned John Chivery. I don't understand it. I hope I may not be so unlucky as to make you think I mean to offend you again, for I have never meant to offend you yet, when I say I don't understand it. Sir, said young John, will you have the perfidy to deny that you know and have long known that I felt towards Miss Dorrit, call it not the presumption of love, but adoration and sacrifice? Indeed, John, I will not have any perfidy if I know it. Why you should suspect me of it, I am at a loss to think. Did you ever hear from Mrs. Chivery, your mother, that I went to see her once? No, sir, returned John shortly. Never heard of such a thing. But I did. Can you imagine why? No, sir, returned John shortly. I can't imagine why. I will tell you. I was solicitous to promote Miss Dorrit's happiness, and if I could have supposed that Miss Dorrit returned your affection— Poor John Chivery turned crimson to the tips of his ears. Miss Dorrit never did, sir. I wish to be honourable and true so far as in my humble way I can, and I would scorn to pretend for a moment that she ever did, or that she ever led me to believe she did. No, nor even that it was ever to be expected in any cool reason that she would or could. She was far above me in all respects at all times, as likewise, added John, similarly was her genteel family. His chivalrous feeling towards all that belonged to her made him so very respectable, in spite of his small stature and his rather weak legs, and his very weak hair, and his poetical temperament, that a Goliath might have sat in his place demanding less consideration at Arthur's hands. "You speak, John," he said, with a cordial admiration, "like a man." "Well, sir," returned John, brushing his hand across his eyes, "then I wish you'd do the same." He was quick with this unexpected retort, and it again made Arthur regard him with a wondering expression of face. "Leastways," said John, stretching his hand across the tea-tray, "if too strong a remark withdrawn. But why not, when I say to you, Mr. Clennam, take care of yourself for someone else's sake, why not be open, though a turnkey? Why did I get you the room which I knew you'd like best? Why did I carry up your things? Not that I found 'em heavy, I don't mention 'em on that account. Far from it. Why have I cultivated you in the manner I have done since the morning? On the ground of your own merits? No. They're very great, I've no doubt at all, but not on the grounds of them. Another's merits have had their weight, and have had far more weight with me. Then why not speak free?" "Unaffectedly, John," said Clennam. "You are so good a fellow, and I have so true a respect for your character, that if I have appeared to be less sensible than I really am of the fact that the kind services you have rendered me today are attributable to my having been trusted by Miss Dorrit as her friend, I confess it to be a fault, and I ask your forgiveness." "Oh, why not?" John repeated with returning scorn. "Why not speak free?" "I declare to you," returned Arthur, "that I do not understand you. Look at me. Consider the trouble I have been in. Is it likely that I would wilfully add to my other self-reproaches that of being ungrateful or treacherous to you? I do not understand you." John's incredulous face slowly softened into a face of doubt. He rose, backed into the garret window of the room, beckoned Arthur to come there, and stood looking at him thoughtfully. "Mr. Clennam, do you mean to say that you don't know?" "What, John?" "Lord," said young John, appealing with a gasp to the spikes on the wall. "He says what?" Clennam looked at the spikes and looked at John, and looked at the spikes and looked at John. "He says what? And what is more," exclaimed young John, surveying him in a doleful maze, "he appears to mean it. Do you see this window, sir?" "Of course I see this window." "See this room?" "Why, of course I see this room." "That wall opposite, and that yard down below? They have all been witness of it, from day to day, from night to night, from week to week, from month to month. For how often have I seen Miss Dorrit here, when she has not seen me?" "Witnesses of what?" said Clennam. "Of Miss Dorrit's love." "For whom?" "You," said John, and touched him with the back of his hand upon the breast, and backed to his chair and sat down on it with a pale face, holding his arms and shaking his head at him. If he had dealt Clennam a heavy blow, instead of laying that light touch upon him, its effect could not have been to shake him more. He stood amazed, his eyes looking at John, his lips parted, and seeming now and then to form the word "me," without uttering it. His hands dropped at his sides, his whole appearance that of a man who has been awakened from sleep, and stupefied by intelligence beyond his full comprehension. "Me," he at length said aloud. "Ah," groaned young John, "you." He did what he could to muster a smile, and returned, "Your fancy. You are completely mistaken." "I mistaken, sir?" said young John. "I completely mistaken on that subject? No, Mr. Clennam, don't tell me so. On any other, if you like, for I don't set up to be a penetrating character, and am well aware of my own deficiencies. But I mistaken on a point that has caused me more smart in my breast than a flight of savages' arrows could have done. I mistaken on a point that almost sent me into my grave, as I sometimes wished it would, if the grave could only have been made